Picture this for a moment. You remember the sound of a dial-up internet connection, that strange robotic screech that meant you were about to enter the online world. But you also remember life before that sound existed, a time when finding information meant flipping through encyclopedias, when boredom meant going outside, when if someone called your house phone, everyone in the family heard it ring. And yet, you also adapted to smartphones, social media, streaming, and a world where almost everything happens online. If that description feels oddly familiar, you might belong to a very specific group of people, not quite Generation X, not quite Millennials either. Psychologists sometimes call this group Xennials. People born roughly between 1976 and 1985 who grew up right on the border between two completely different worlds. And what's fascinating is that this unusual position created a very unique psychology, because Xennials didn't just live through change, their brains were shaped by it. Let me show you what I mean. Imagine growing up in the 1980s or early 90s. Your childhood was mostly analog. If you wanted to see your friends, you knocked on their door. If you got lost, you used a map. If you wanted to listen to music, you waited for your favorite song to come on the radio. Patience wasn't optional, it was normal. Now, fast forward a decade or two. Suddenly, everything is instant. Information, communication, entertainment, shopping, news, opinions. Your brain went from a slow-paced world to a hyper-connected one almost overnight. Psychologically, that kind of transition is incredibly unusual. Most generations adapt gradually to the technology around them, but Xennials experienced something closer to a cultural earthquake. One day the world was mostly offline, the next day it wasn't. And growing up during that shift created a very interesting mental balance. Xennials often have what psychologists might call dual cognitive frameworks. Part of their brain still understands the slower rhythms of pre-digital life, but another part adapted to the speed and chaos of the digital age. Think of it like being bilingual, except instead of languages, you're fluent in two completely different ways of living. And this can show up in everyday behaviors in ways people don't always notice. For example, many Xennials feel comfortable with technology, but they also feel slightly skeptical of it. They can use social media, but they don't always trust it. They rely on digital tools, but they still remember how life worked without them. Their brains constantly compare both worlds, and this comparison creates a kind of psychological perspective that younger generations sometimes don't have. Because if you never lived without smartphones, you don't really think about what changed. But Xennials remember the transition. They watch the world shift in real time, and that awareness shapes how they think. Another fascinating psychological pattern shows up in the way Xennials handle nostalgia. You've probably noticed this if you're in that age group. Music from the 90s hits differently. Old video games feel strangely emotional. Even the memory of simple things like renting movies or recording songs from the radio can trigger a powerful feeling. This isn't just sentimentality. Psychology research shows that the brain tends to form especially strong emotional memories during periods of rapid cultural change. And the late 80s and 90s were exactly that. Technology was evolving, the internet was appearing, media was transforming. For Xennials, childhood memories are tied to the last era before the digital explosion. So nostalgia becomes more than just remembering the past, it becomes remembering an entire version of the world that no longer exists. And that can create a very reflective personality style. Many Xennials tend to analyze the past and present more than other groups. They compare how things used to work with how they work now. Sometimes this leads to humor, jokes about floppy disks, dial-up internet, or how kids today will never understand waiting for a web page to load. But beneath the humor is something deeper, perspective. Because when you've lived through massive technological change, you naturally become more aware of how quickly things can shift. This awareness also influences how Xennials approach work and success. A lot of people in this generation grew up hearing very traditional advice about career paths. Study hard, get a stable job, stay loyal to a company. But then the real world changed. Industries evolved, jobs became less stable, entire professions disappeared while new ones appeared overnight. So many Xennials developed a slightly complicated relationship with work. Part of them values stability. Another part understands that stability can disappear quickly. Psychologically, this can create a mindset that mixes responsibility with adaptability. They might not chase trends the way younger generations do, but they're often surprisingly flexible when circumstances change. And that flexibility is something psychologists sometimes call adaptive resilience. It happens when people experience enough change in their lives that their brains learn how to adjust without completely losing their sense of identity. But the Xennial experience isn't only about technology. There's also a social side to this generation that's really interesting. If you think about it, Xennials were among the last kids to grow up with mostly offline social lives. Friendships were built through physical presence, hanging out after school, talking face-to-face, riding bikes around the neighborhood. Then suddenly, social media arrived, and the rules of connection changed. Now relationships included text messages, online profiles, and digital communication. This created a fascinating hybrid social skill set. Many Xennials feel comfortable in both environments. They understand the depth of in-person connection, but they also know how to navigate digital communication. And this can sometimes make them strong mediators between generations. Younger coworkers might move quickly through digital platforms. Older coworkers might prefer traditional communication. Xennials often sit somewhere in the middle, translating both worlds. But there's another psychological effect of growing up in this transitional era. Something subtle but powerful. Uncertainty tolerance. When you've watched the world transform multiple times during your lifetime, your brain becomes more comfortable with unpredictability. You've already seen how dramatically things can change, so the idea of future change doesn't feel as shocking. In some ways, Xennials developed mental muscles for adaptation simply by living through a period of rapid transformation. Of course, that doesn't mean everything feels easy. Sometimes it can feel like a strange identity question. If you're a Xennial, you might occasionally feel like you don't fully belong to either generation. Too young to relate completely to Generation X, too old to fully identify with Millennials. It's like standing on a bridge between two cultural worlds. But here's the interesting psychological twist. Bridges are actually very powerful places to stand, because they give you perspective from both sides. And perspective is one of the most valuable cognitive tools a person can have. When you understand both the past and the present, you become better at imagining the future. You're less likely to panic when things change, and more likely to adapt when they do. So if you happen to fall into that small window of people born between the late 70s and mid-80s, the unique way your brain processes the world isn't random. It's the result of growing up during one of the most transformative periods in modern history. You experience the last moments of a slower analog world and the birth of the digital one. Your brain learned both languages, and that's a rare thing. So the next time you hear the nostalgic sound of dial-up internet in a meme, or someone jokes about floppy disks, it might feel more than just humor. It might feel like a reminder. A reminder that you belong to a generation that didn't just watch the world change, you adapted alongside it. And if you think about it, that ability to adapt may be one of the most important psychological skills a person can have in a world that keeps changing faster every year. So now I'm curious, if you're a Xennial, what's the one thing from the pre-internet world you secretly wish still existed today? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden psychology behind generations, habits, and the way our minds adapt to the world around us, make sure you stick around for the next video, because the human mind is full of fascinating stories, and we're just getting started.